you've got this, because Spiked was tweeting this out a couple of days ago. No, Israel is not a settler-colonial state. Those painting Israel as a colonial power are rewriting history. This is all a blatant attempt to strip Jews of their humanity, writes James Hartfield. Now, of course, it's not a blatant attempt to strip Jews of their humanity at all, but the question is Israel effectively a colonial power, or a pawn of a colonial power, perhaps? Let's listen to RFK Jr.
And Israel is critical. And the reason it's critical is because it's a bulwark for us in the Mideast. It's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Mideast. It's our oldest ally. It's been our ally for 75 years. It has been an incredible ally for us in terms of the technology, the exchange. And, and building the Iron Dome, which we've paid a lot for, has also taught us enormously about how to defend ourselves at home from missiles. So those military expenditures are all going, 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU. But if you look at what's happening in the Mideast now, Iran is now the closest allies to Iran are Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil. Hezbollah is in Venezuela. They have propped up the Maduro regime, and so they control that oil supply. BRICS, Saudi Arabia is now joining BRICS. So those countries will control 90% of the oil in the world. If Israel disappears, the vacuum in the Mideast, which is, Israel is our ambassador, it's our presence, our beachhead in the Mideast, and it gives us ears and eyes in the Mideast. It gives us intelligence. It gives us the capacity to influence affairs in the Mideast. If Israel disappeared, Russia and China would be controlling the Mideast, and they control 90% of the world's oil supply, and that would be cataclysmic for U.S. national security. So that's the answer to you.
I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it's absolutely clear, and I personally believe what he's saying is correct. He's called it a beachhead, he's called it an aircraft carrier. He's certainly not describing it as a country. It's a tool to enable and protect the power of the US, a country terrified that it will lose access to the world's oil.
Yes, so it sounds a bit like, well, at the very least, neocolonialism, Vanessa, but what have you got on the war itself? Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to recall Julian Assange's words, which is that war is almost always created by lies. So what I wanted to look at today is at least kind of continuing to decipher some of the headlines that are effectively enabling the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians, as admitted by members of the Israeli government. The Heritage Minister calling for the nuking of Palestinians in Gaza, and the various documents that have been released showing their plans to ethnically cleanse all of Palestine, of Palestinians, and to convert it into an Israeli-only state. So first of all, number one, let's have a look at the trope that kind of carries through every single time that Israel carries out an aggression, whether it's against Palestinians, or against Syria, or against Iraq, or against any country in the region, Israel's right to self-defense. So let's have a look at what this really means. If we look at the first slide, which is an article from Sam Husseini, I recommend everybody following his Substack. He's recently been pressuring the US State Department over what is happening in Palestine and the crimes being carried out by Israel against Palestinians. So he asks, is Israel really targeting Hamas? Does the US recognize the Fourth Geneva Convention? Questioning the State Department. So let's have a look at what he's referring to. He sent an email to Richard Falk, a very well-known professor emeritus in the US on international law, now retired, but chairman of Euromed Monitor, one of the foremost humanitarian or human rights agencies in Europe. And he basically replied to Sam Husseini on the question of self-defense, a very similar reply actually to the one that Vasily Nebensia, the Russian representative in the UN, or the statement he gave in the UN that we mentioned last week. So Richard Falk basically said Gaza remains, from the perspective of international law and the UN, an occupied Palestine territory, subject to the Fourth Geneva Convention. This means that Israel is an occupying power and has a primary obligation to safeguard the safety of the civilian population. As such, it has no international legal right of self-defense. Even if it had such a right of self-defense, it wouldn't have any legal or moral basis for engaging in a genocidal assault, the character of which has been strongly confirmed by Israel's top leaders. So that's number one. So then let's move on to the second one, which is Hamas atrocities. Many of those have been debunked. We've mentioned it various times on UK Column. But I want today to look particularly at this report in Hebrew media at YNet. So it's been translated from Hebrew. It doesn't read particularly well. But what I want to point out is that these helicopter pilots on the day, so on the 7th of October, were carrying out attacks against basically unidentified targets over a period of 4 hours and hit about 300 targets. So bear that in mind. Then moving on, let's see what they say. They say basically they realized that there was tremendous difficulty in distinguishing within the posts and localities occupied by a terrorist and a soldier or civilian. So in other words, they had great difficulty in identifying whether the targets were the resistance factions or actually civilians that were at the rave. 28 combat helicopters fired all ammunition in their arsenal throughout the day of combat in rearmament rounds. The Hamas army, it turns out, deliberately, I'm not sure what that means, but basically what they say is that Hamas had instructions not to run, not to reveal themselves in the crowd. So effectively what that says to me is that these helicopter pilots had absolutely no idea what they were hitting, but they continued hitting for 4 hours with pretty heavy duty weapons. This was a video actually included in the Hebrew article, and then I've added to it footage that was released by the IOF and was put out on social media by RT. So the two together. The first shows the targeting of targets. I don't know how they could have identified who they were, and then it shows the aftermath. If you can roll that, please, Mike.
קיבלתי קוצר אחד, לזיקים קם דיווח בין 0-1.
עשרות אנשים שמנסים להיכנס מול נחל עוז.
אתם מנסים חזרה לרצועה על ציר.
בסדר, חצו הרבה מזרחה, ביצעתי עליהם טיל.
I would argue that the extent of that damage and the incinerated bodies that I didn't show the video of would suggest that that was carried out by the Apache helicopters, not by the resistance that was basically armed with relatively light weapons. And then moving on to the third narrative that underpins the justification for Israeli war crimes, or effectively for genocide in West Bank and in Gaza. The Hamas human shield, the claim that Hamas is using civilians in Gaza as human shields. Again, it's an article that I've written up at my Substack. It is packed full of resources and reports, so I recommend people go and have a look. Basically, the conclusion is that there is no legal evidence that Hamas has ever used human shields. That comes from the likes of Jeremy Bowen at the BBC, who was in Gaza during the 2014 Israeli aggression against Gaza, from the Belfast Telegraph, from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, from various legal, local human rights groups. However, Israel has used children in particular, but Palestinian civilians as human shields since 1967 is voluminous. And I have included almost every single link that I found from legal groups, human rights groups, even Israeli human rights groups. And actually, interestingly, this practice began under the British mandate between 1922 to 1947. In the 30s, in particular, the British military to put down the Palestinian uprising against the influx of European Jews that were dispossessing them of their territory at the behest of the British colonial project at the time, were using Palestinians as human shields. And that practice was then picked up by the Zionist forces. So this is just one example. This was from May 2023. Israeli forces use 5 Palestinian children as human shields. So let's have a look at what they generally do. I have to say also, in all the reports, the children that are used as human shields are also abused, tortured, in some ways sexually. They are humiliated, and they are kept prisoner for extended periods of time. So this was on May the 18th, 2023, or the report was written. Israeli forces surrounded the Shalom family home and used 4 Palestinian children as human shields. This was on March the 1st. Israeli soldiers ordered everyone out of the house and demanded that their father, Maher Shalom, surrender himself. While Maher stayed inside, the others complied and went outside. Israeli forces then threatened his sons, Nidal, 9, Karam, 11, in addition to his twin nephews, Ahmed and Mohammed, both 2 years old, and forced them to stand in front of Israeli military vehicles while Israeli forces fired tear gas canisters, stun grenades, and live ammunition at Palestinians confronting the group of soldiers. As I said, please do go to that article because you will find multiple documentation of the crimes of using human shields by the Israelis, and none of Hamas doing so. The final one that I wanted to again deal with is the fact that people are claiming Hamas is a terrorist group. As I've explained before, there are 17 resistance factions inside Gaza alone. Hamas political wing is largely separate to the resistance forces, to the Qassam military brigade. I won't go into massive detail now because we're on limited time, but I recommend everybody watches this interview by Kevork Almasyan with Zach Foster, who's an American academic who has devoted quite a lot of his research to the history and the creation of Hamas, the fact that Hamas put through, I think, 10 peace deal proposals in the early days of their establishment, which were not even considered by their Israeli counterparts. But he goes into huge detail, and I think he gives a very valid explanation of who Hamas is, where their roots came from, and why the armed resistance is reacting as it is now and in the past.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for that. We will move on